everyone. Welcome back to REIMAGINE 2021 version 9 Game of Chains. We're back with another event. This is our 9th event. I'm Roshan Mirajkar, one of your guest hosts for this event. And this time we're really exploring, the innovation that's happening in the space with layer 2, a lot of cross-chain projects. And we really want to highlight, how these different blockchains are interacting in the ecosystem and what impact it's really had on the entire community as a whole. I'm very excited to be joined here by a returning guest. With me here today, I have Arthur Breitman, who is the founder at Tezos. Arthur, welcome back to the show. And really great to have you back. I think just to get started, want to give you a chance to let us know, like, how's it been going for you and your team since the last time we spoke? And yeah, just tell us a brief introduction on like what Tezos is.
Hi, well, thanks, and it's good to be back. I think it was a few months ago that I was on this on this conference or show, so I don't the time is a blur, but I think one of the main things is that we've been experiencing exponential growth in usage of the network. I think in May we had 1.5 million smart contract calls. It's coming up to 2 million for June, and it's been growing 10-11 months in a row. So lots of adoption has been driven by mostly by a art platform called Hic et Nunc, which has attracted a ton of artists creating NFTs, and also with a lot of new coins being traded on a decentralized exchanges like QuickSwap. So those have been essentially leading the charge in terms of network usage. And so that's big news. And there's also several projects which are launching on Tezos. Red Bull Racing is launching its series of NFTs to engage with its fan on a Tezos blockchain. And one of is focusing also on NFTs on the music side, and has signed major artists to launch their NFTs and for NFTs for their albums on the Tezos chain. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, congrats on all of those advancements, and really excited to cover, some of those important use cases and kind of like the convergence of what you all have been able to do to get into a lot of these traditional, partners, things like Red Bull. It's definitely going to give a lot of exposure, to the mass adoption, as everyone says. Yeah, but before we kind of get into those things, tell us a little bit about, what is kind of what is your ethos behind some of the foundations of Tezos, and what role do you see Tezos playing in the blockchain ecosystem?
Yeah, I think the main idea of Tezos is to be able to keep up with innovation without sacrificing decentralization. I remember, in 2012, 13, you would talk to people in cryptocurrency circle, which were essentially Bitcoin circle at the time, and people would say Bitcoin is just a ledger. It's what defines Bitcoin is a set of UTXO. The algorithm, the consensus, all of this is basically secondary. What matters is a property record, and we can put any algorithm on it if anything better comes along. And I think that was a great ethos. The problem is that it doesn't really specify how those changes can come along or how they can be adopted. And I think quickly the Bitcoin community converged to the idea that there would basically be almost no changes, and a lot of the design decisions became pretty much enshrined in stone, especially the aspect, the insistence of proof of work. In parallel, so other cryptocurrencies launch and adopt a much more loose approach to upgrades by saying, we'll just convince everyone to run a new version, and that will let us advance. If people don't like the new version, they don't have to run it. And of course, I think that choice is kind of illusory, because you have to guess what everyone is going to want to run, because there's no point in being an independent network. So Tezos tries something in the middle where it says we are going to change, but if we're going to adopt changes, it has to follow a formal process, and we use a chain as a source of consensus. So it's a chain that can upgrade itself. And part of the ESO of Tezos is a strong commitment to decentralization. And it means essentially keeping the token holders in control of the chain, whether through the consensus algorithm or through the approval of any change to the protocol.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's very different than how a lot of these other protocols and chains kind of do governance. So can you explain a little more about kind of the self-amending updates, or your self-governance mechanism? Like, kind of take us through like how was it when it started, and how has it been, going for the past couple of months? Like, what changes have you seen?
Yeah, so I think that Tezos has upgraded 6 times over the past 3 years. That's more than any other blockchain. There's a seventh upgrade which is coming. One thing which I find quite interesting is that the seventh upgrade is probably the most controversial that we've had so far. It has an 83% approval rating. Now that might sound super high, but the bar for approval is 80%. So this is one which was a bit contentious. And what I find to be super interesting is that I think it's an upgrade that if we were reliant on hard fork might not have happened. And the reason for this is I find a lot of hard forks are based on proof of social media, as opposed to actual genuine discussion and consensus. And so if we had a hard fork, I think some people might have thought, oh, wow, there's a lot of noise. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if I should run a hard fork. Or it might have been seen as illegitimate, as a hard fork being forced. And the fact that we're relying on this procedure is, I think, a great way to have somewhat controversial upgrade goes through the legitimacy of on-chain governance. And that's super important. And I think it really demonstrates the power of this approach. Now, the upgrade itself, and it's still being voted on, I think, there's a current voting phase, which ends in about a little more than a week, and then there will be a quiet period, and then another voting phase. So, it's yet to be determined whether or not the upgrade will be accepted. But if accepted, it has a feature that was dubbed liquidity baking, where essentially the protocol is going to issue a little bit of inflation. We're talking about 0.15%, 0.15. So it's very, very small amount of inflation. But a very small amount of inflation is going to subsidize an AMM on the chain between a wrapped version of Bitcoin and Tez itself. So it's a way basically to use a little bit of inflation to subsidize a large amount of liquidity provision. And I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty good mechanism, and you all have definitely, I feel, figured out a lot of the pain points and problems in the ecosystem that wasn't driving a lot of usage early on. But now, as you said, you've seen like billions of smart contracts being created, and kind of from your perspective, do you think that we'll always have different blockchains kind of in competition with another? Or do you think that over time, there'll be more bridges with other chains?
Yeah, so I'm a pessimist. And well, I mean, I'm not a pessimist in general. I don't think I have a bias towards pessimism or optimism. But the position that I believe to be correct here is one which is not good, but it's a reality. I think it's basically a lot of the reasons why we have many chains today is lack of scalability, but I think that eventually scalability is going to be solved by everyone. This technology just like ends up percolating. And so the space is going to get a lot more competitive than it already is. And there's going to be consolidation of existing blockchains, like a ton of consolidation. I also think that a lot of the projects who try to extract rent from smart contracts are going to suffer from a ton of competition. So essentially, I foresee the space as being far more competitive, which can be good for some projects which are incumbent, but it can also be bad if they're relying on tokenomic model, which are based on having value through transactions or like through capturing some fees. So it will be interesting to watch, but I'd rather have a clear view of what's going to happen, because I think trying to play a game where you are just going to say, oh, I'll find my niche, that's not going to work. All these niches are going to be destroyed. So I think it's interesting to make concentrated bets and go after specific verticals, because it's a way to build network effect. But ultimately, the only way to win this game is by trying to be a global settlement layer, and nothing else is going to cut it.
Yeah, for sure. That's an interesting point of view. And what I was going to ask you as well is, over time, in the past couple of years, what use cases have you seen the most for Tezos? Like, what have you seen people slowly evolve and use more for Tezos? Are there any specific applications or decentralized apps that perform better?
Yeah, so I think the main use case for Tezos is the main use case for every single cryptocurrency out there. It's basically a censorship-resistant store of value, and it's a way to own something directly to which you have title to, which is in your possession, in your custody. And that's, to me, is the main appeal of cryptocurrencies. And, I think holding is using, basically. And that's something that people don't quite see. It's not about just being a platform for applications. It's primarily about being a cryptocurrency and a store of value. And so, de facto, I think, even on a lot of, even if you take, for example, Ethereum, which has a bunch of applications, I think most people who hold Ether, they hold it as a store of value and not necessarily because they want to pay transaction fees in ETH. But in terms of applications which have been very popular on Tezos, I think NFTs have been extremely, have had a ton of traction. Hikenuk is the most active art marketplace, all chains combined in some Tezos. Tezos recently had about a quarter of the transaction volume on Ethereum. So it's really attracting a ton of interest. And the other one is just in general DeFi. I think DeFi applications took quite a bit of time to get to Tezos, but they're getting here now, and they're getting quite a bit of traction.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of different waves of applications as different things get popularized. First it was DeFi, and now it seems to be NFTs. I've definitely seen a lot of community members create NFTs on Tezos, and that was kind of one of my questions as well. Like, what is the best way? Like, how can you describe to us how we should think about? A lot of people compare it, like, for example, Tezos to Ethereum. Do you see it as more of a competitor? And does that question really even matter in the broader scope of the industry right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's competing against everyone. And some people don't like to say it, but it's true. Ethereum is competing with Bitcoin, Tezos is competing with Bitcoin, Tezos is competing with Ethereum. And it doesn't mean that, it's an easy task to compete with, very large incumbents, but it's just a matter of fact. It's going after the same users and it's going after the same use cases. I think Bitcoin kind of limited itself in the use cases that can be around Bitcoin by deciding not to have, well, it's not like anyone took the decision, but there was, with the ethos of basically not having smart contracts, I think it limits the possibilities. But in general, the main use case, I think, for everyone is store of value, censorship resistant store of value. And so everyone's competing for the same thing, even if they don't say it. What I find hilarious is that you have a lot of projects around Ethereum who market themselves as not competing with Ethereum, even though they're actually directly competing with Ethereum. And they've all done it. I think early days of Cosmos, they were saying like, oh, we're going to hard spoon Ethereum. What does it mean? Oh, we'll copy all their contracts and try to get the network effects. But a spoon is nice. It's not like, it's not pointy like a fork. Or Definity saying like, we'll be a sister network to Ethereum. What does that mean? Or Polygon, saying like, oh, we're a scaling solution for Ethereum. No, you're competing shit with your own token, and fees based on like Polygon or Matic are not fees going to Ethereum. You're directly competing. It's not that different from, like your competing relationship with Ethereum is not that different from that of Tron. Marketed completely differently. But if you just look at, is it complementary or competitive? It's completely competitive. And a lot of people don't want to admit it, but it's competition. Now, competition doesn't mean you have to be an asshole about it. There's a lot of people has this like, well, either you're complementary or somehow you're mortal enemy and I'm going to wage some sort of religious war against you. I think you can, compete and admit that you're competing and still be nice about it.
Yeah, 100%. That's actually a really great point. Like in all other industries, competition breeds innovation, and our industry is no different. So can you kind of walk us through a little bit of the journey of like, what did it take to build a completely different chain, as opposed to like, what kind of different value creation do you get as opposed to finding an existing chain and, as you're saying, creating value from a fork from the existing network effect? Like what were the, I don't know, top 3 things that were important to you to, create such a big blockchain with different parties involved?
So first of all, I don't think there's many forks which have actually gotten a ton of traction by having this user base. The main ones are, I want to say Ethereum Classic, and of course Ethereum Classic is the original, it's not the fork. But let's say it's a minority branch of the fork. So there's been BCH, BSV, but I think a lot of these things also have a lot of market cap sometimes because they inherited a lot of dead coins from the early chain. And so if you look at some of the stuff that Coinmetric is doing, where they're looking at what is the actual supply based on the age of UTXOs and like what has moved when, you get a better view, and actually they're much smaller than they appear in terms of market cap. I don't think I think in some sense forking, there's the difference between forking a code base, saying like, I like this code base, I'm going to start over with this code base, and like forking to get users strikes me as like slightly worse than doing an airdrop, right? You could launch a new chain and just say, I'm going to do an airdrop on like everyone who wants a token, because at least you get people who are interested. Or I'm going to do an airdrop on all the addresses which have been active for the past year or something like this. For the reason people fork, they don't do it because they want to get a community, they do it because they want legitimacy. Almost single fork like this has been made with the idea that they are the original. So, minority branch, Ethereum Classic say, no, where's the original? So they have to keep these balances, because they're the original. If they don't have them, then they lose the narrative. Same thing for Bitcoin Cash. Bitcoin Cash is Bitcoin. So if somehow they do a weird airdrop, then they lose that narrative. But I don't think it's going to go very, very far. And if anything, you're much better off trying to basically. So whenever you launch a chain, you're going to have a genesis block, and that genesis block is going to contain an allocation. You can have no allocation and say everything is going to be mined, which of course doesn't work with proof of stake. Or you could do something which is kind of similar to auctioning off the genesis block, which doesn't mean that people are going to accept this, but at least you can auction off one proposal for the genesis block. And if you do that, you actually get a surplus, and you can do that to endow nonprofits, which is what happened with Tezos. Or you could do it for other things. You could give it to charity. You could do a whole lot of things which are more efficient than just randomly, airdropping it on some other chain.
Yeah, for sure. Those are all great points, especially when you're talking about the Genesis block. I think as more new people come into crypto, they're going to slowly learn about those things, where you can actually look back on a chain and actually find the true origination. It's one of my favorite things about the blockchain. You can kind of look at the entire history. And kind of speaking about history, or maybe speaking about the future, everyone always talks about the launch of ETH 2.0 and how it took so long. Tezos started with, being proof of stake. So from your point of view, like, why do you think proof of stake is going to have such a big impact on the world? And what advantages do you think it has over some other coins like Bitcoin that are still proof of work? Are there any specific use cases, applications?
First of all, is that almost no new chain is launching with proof of work. Like if you think of recent chains which have proof of work, I think you had like Nervous, I think is proof of work. I think Grin. Well, I mean, I know Grin was proof of work, but I think Grin was fairly recent. Grin and BIM. And there was this other one whose name I can't recall. They have a list like programming language, but I haven't really heard from them in a while. So anyways, everyone who's launching a chain now is launching proof of stake. And there's several reasons for that. One is that any small proof of work chain now is getting attacked, and is getting 51% attacked. And second is that I think in general, the arguments for proof of stake have largely won outside of people who are really, really attached to proof of work. So people really attached to Bitcoin, for example. So it's the general argument that's given against proof of stake is that there's some properties you get with proof of work which are impossible to get with proof of stake. And the argument goes like this. So you connect to the network for the first time. And so you connect to a peer-to-peer network, and then people say, hey, here's one version of the chain. And another person say, here's another version of the chain. And the question is, well, which one is a real one? It's kind of like, you have a clone, and one is a clone and one is a real person. It's like, how do I know which is which? And in proof of work, you can't do that because creating a clone will be very, very expensive. It's prohibitive, so it's not going to happen, or at least it's very unlikely. In proof of stake, it would be very cheap to do a fake chain. And so the argument goes, well, you have no way of distinguishing it. So there goes the argument. It's impossible. You're going to checkpoint hits regularly. You're going to have to have this. And that argument is completely true. What's completely false is that it matters. It's a niche property, but we don't really care about it because it's just never the case that you connect to a network and you have any doubts. First of all, so like on Tezos, for example, every single transaction you see on a chain signs a block. So if you know just one person who's using the chain, you can look at their signature and you can identify which branch they were using. If you know a single honest party who's been connected, just one, you don't have to trust, you just like need to find one person, you're good. But it's even deeper than that. So the goal is to be global money, right? A global form of currency. So essentially you go and you try to buy an item and the merchant is going to be in a specific branch. So you know which branch it is. If there's two branches, there's only one the merchant is going to accept. And it's just, it gets so entangled with reality. There's just like so much, it's impossible to miss. And you could make the same argument, by the way, with downloading the Bitcoin client, saying like, oh, with Bitcoin, you can just look at the chain and it tells you everything you need to know. Well, you need to, which clients do you download? Well, it's obvious, you go to GitHub, you know which client to get. No, it's not obvious. Maybe you have to trust someone to give you his initial client. So it's kind of it's really a non-issue. The main way it can be an issue is if somehow the world internet stops for like 2 or 3 weeks, like no internet for a month. So your chain doesn't make progress for an entire month. And then when you restart, then how do you form consensus? Because you could have different versions, everyone unbounded. So first of all, this is a very rare event. And second of all, if this happens, like everyone's going to have bigger problems to deal with. And also it's not impossible to regain like some sort of manual consensus. Yes, you get disruption, but it's like you get epsilon more disruption in an event which is already massively disruptive. So I don't think it's a good argument against proof of stake. However, proof of stake has advantages against proof of work that are massive. And in proof of work, essentially, if you have a coalition against 51%, so they can attack the chain, they can censor transactions, they can create reorganizations. So creating reorganizations, once you see they happen, basically you stop commerce, you get to stop the chain. And you can prevent, the way you defend against that is by changing your algorithm. So you could say, but I can change my hash function and now all their ASICs are worthless. What's interesting here is that you're depending not on the energy consumption, but on the fact that you have actual capital. So, it's like the ASIC acts as a stake, which is already why it's more interesting. But the problem is that you have to punish everyone equally. So you're punishing the attacker and you're punishing the honest people at the same time. So everyone is kind of worse off. So it only works as like a threat in some sense. Like if you do this, I will waste you. I will waste all your machines. In proof of stake, you can do something a little better because you can know which party is misbehaving. And so you can slash the party that is misbehaving. So you get to have massive deflation and you only hurt the bad guys and not the good guys. So the good guys get an asymmetric advantage over the bad guy, which is a really neat property of proof of stake that you don't have in proof of work. So that's the main reason. But the other thing as well is that proof of stake is a lot less inflationary than proof of work. Proof of work requires a ton of inflation to secure itself because you need to pay the miners. Whereas here, the money stays in the system. So you need a little bit of inflation to pay for all the locked capital, which is at stake. But that's going to be a lot less than proof of work. And it's also, and it's also largely internal. So that's a huge benefit to proof of stake, is that if you want sound money, if you don't want inflation, you're actually a lot better off not spending your money on energy.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think a lot of people are still learning the differences of different consensus protocols with all the different chains, trying to figure out which ones are forked, which ones have like a origination point. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is, you talked a lot about the use cases, a lot of just now about, how it's energy efficient and all these different things. So right now, that's been the discussion in kind of the macro world in our industry, where a lot of people are, pointing at the companies like Tesla and saying, Elon Musk doesn't want to accept Bitcoin because of its energy use. But I also find it interesting that there haven't been a lot of institutions that, have put Ethereum or other, layer 1, layer 2 coins on their balance sheet. So for institutions, how long do you think it will take until they actually have more of these assets on their balance sheet and they start to transition some of their assets kind of on chain or on the side chain?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how long it will take for this to happen. And I think it's some, I think it basically an incumbent in this case, because you get, like the most, the institutions are most conservative. So I think they're going to take some time in terms of looking at this. But let's see. I think what's interesting as well is just tokenization of other assets that they hold, and I think holding the assets on chain has some benefits that they might get to see. I think the DeFi yield might attract people to keep their assets in stablecoin because it's just like an interesting market, and there's some benefits to holding it outside of banks. But generally speaking, I still think it's going to be slow. There's a potential for FOMO, which is interesting. Right now, if you're a CFO and you say like, let's put some cryptocurrency on the balance sheet, you're wondering if you're going to get fired. And what might flip a switch is when we get to the point where like you're the CFO and you worry that if you don't, you're going to get fired because everyone's doing it, and all of a sudden it's not risky for you to do it because everyone else is doing it. But if you don't do it, then you get in trouble. Imagine everyone does well, and then they're like, "Why didn't you do it?" And you're like, "I didn't know." Whereas if tomorrow, for example, you have Microsoft doing it, and just like random company, and you do it, and then it does poorly, and they say, "Oh, why did you do that?" And they say, "Well, Microsoft did it, so clearly I didn't do anything wrong." So, some people could still get fired today for adding Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies to the balance sheet. Absolutely. It gets interesting when some people like think, "Oh, I might get fired if I don't do it."
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Cover your ass effect can be extremely powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in the traditional world, I think, where you have more of that cascading domino effect where, just to stay competitive. And I think a lot of traditional players are kind of losing their clients, or maybe even losing like the retail traders and investors, because they're flocking to like better alternatives in this weird world we live in. But again, you've been able to pull off some interesting things. So can you tell us a little bit more just about Tezos and the Red Bull partnership you have, kind of the NFTs that you're looking to create? And maybe if you can tell us a little bit about why they decided to choose Tezos.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of the NFT adoption have come from people having concern over the energy cost, like you were mentioning, of proof of work. And so there's two aspects essentially to the energy consumption of proof of work. One is like, hey, it's expensive, it's inflation. This is like purely economical. It doesn't matter if you are spending it on energy or if you're spending it on digging holes or what have you. It's just costly, and it's costly for the entire chain. So there's the inflation angle, and the other angle is to say, well, it's not just any cost. It's a cost. If you're buying energy, you're basically buying something. It's bad to buy energy because in some sense you're paying less than the full price of the energy, because energy production has externalities, and these externalities are not captured in the price of energy. And so there's this idea that somehow if you buy, if you buy more energy than you need, or if you buy energy and you have alternatives, then in some sense, you're contributing to the negative externalities of that. And I think there's some merit to this argument. I also think there's merit to the argument of people saying, look, Bitcoin spends the marginal electricity, and that electricity is going to be renewables generally, because when there's no demand for anything else, and people are when you have a bunch of like windmills, for example, and there's a bunch of wind, people might not be needing electricity at the same time, so you get surplus, and because the surplus is free, then in some sense Bitcoin benefits from it. But there's two things which are interesting here. One is that you're actually kind of negating the argument for the security of Bitcoin, because if you're saying like, oh, the energy we're using marginally is free. Okay, well, if that's the case, then where does the security come from? It has to be costly to mine, and it will be costly, because if somehow you're using free energy, then you're just going to keep growing and growing and growing and growing. At which point you're going to use a lot more than this excess energy. So there's a bit of a flaw here, and in this argument. The other thing as well is that you are crowding out other solutions like batteries. People will say Bitcoin is a battery, but what would be super interesting is grid scale batteries. Like people actually taking these sodium sulfur batteries, putting them on the grid and saying, hey, yes, we have excess from these windmills, but if we actually store it, we can restore it to the grid later on. And if you actually, if you arbitrage the low off-peak price, then you're essentially like preventing it to be arbitraged by other solutions, which would reduce the need for carbon fuel sources. So in some sense, it's a little bit of a subtle argument, but you're crowding out other solutions. And the last point is that you're turning it again into proof of stake, because all of a sudden it becomes, what do you need for making a Bitcoin? And it used to be that all you needed was electricity. So it's just like there's a cost of the block and that's it. And then like, well, you need electricity and an ASIC. And actually a good part of the value of a block goes to the depreciation of the ASIC. And it can turn into like, oh, well, what you need is an ASIC and a windmill. You have this thing and that's your stake. And so you produce at zero cost because all your cost is just depreciation of this. So I don't know, it can go either way, but it was definitely a source of adoption because a lot of people are concerned about this. There's a lot of tremendous artists who gave up on making NFTs because they really didn't want to contribute to a proof of work chain. And I think it's great to offer an alternative with proof of stake where, the question doesn't even like appear because it's just consuming, 2 million of the energy consumption. So I'm glad that all of artists were able to create NFTs on Tezos without having the conundrum of contributing to the power generation that's involved in proof of work.
Yeah, those are actually some very interesting thoughts on just the energy debate. So really glad to get your thoughts there. I'm sure a lot of people will have some feedback on what you just said and maybe even rethink, right? I think it's also important to kind of always be updating your different beliefs. A question that I had kind of on the development forefront is for the developers that maybe are still working on like proof of work coins, or Ethereum is slowly getting to proof of stake. What advantages have you seen for developers, or like what can you tell us on how quickly you can make different upgrades and maybe even scalability? Like what are some benefits on working on like layer one chains?
So, I mean, the upgradability of Tezos is different from the proof of stake aspect. The only overlap is that it's good in general to be proof of stake if you want to upgrade your chain, because otherwise you can get conflict with the miners. The miners can have interests that really diverge from the token holders. You've seen this, for example, in Ethereum's EIP 1559, which is not really good for miners, but in my opinion, good for Ethereum. And so, wait, no, it's bad for Ethereum. Don't do it. Anyways, it's one of these conflicts, and you have a lot less of this conflict when you're proof of stake. But the upgradability of Tezos is really different, and I think it's maybe because of Tezos, because we kind of like had both this focus on proof of stake and governance. A lot of people incorrectly assume that proof of stake means governance. That proof of stake means that people are voting on what the algorithm should be, and that's not the case at all. You could have the same ethos as Bitcoin of saying like we're never going to change the code no matter what, or we'll do this very, very minor sort of soft forks once every 4 years. So you could do that and still be proof of stake, and you could be completely proof of work and have an upgradable ledger. But the benefit of working on a layer one, which has this flexibility, is that a lot of things get easier to implement. For example, if you want to implement an optimistic rollup on Tezos, you could try to do it by implementing a version of the Michelson virtual machine inside Michelson that can replay instructions and do all this, which carries a bunch of overhead and is a little complicated. Or you could just modify the protocol to say, hey, let's add replaying a transaction as a primitive. So the fact that it's very easy to add primitives to the protocol, I think makes it a little better for evolving and growing. I mean, in theory, having a virtual machine could let you do anything. You have a virtual machine, you say, no, we'll build everything as a smart contract, nothing in the protocol. We'll get precompiles maybe. But there's a lot of overhead in doing things this way, and a lot of time it's very, very useful to do things at a protocol level. The other thing it lets you do is control inflation, which I think is quite useful. Even if you had a perfect platform in terms of like being able to do everything as a smart contract as opposed to changing the code of the protocol, it's nice to be able to say, hey, let's solve some collective action problems using a little bit of inflation, which is one of the things mentioned in the Tezos position paper. For builders, it essentially also means that the chain can keep up to date and has reasonable prospect of keeping up with the advances of technology.
Yeah, those are things that I haven't really heard other people cover. I just thought it was a really interesting question on, the other side of the community, like the developers. Everyone has different decisions on what to contribute to, and I think it's interesting also that sometimes with these bridges, you can also contribute to like multiple chains at once. But yeah, no, thank you for covering that. Great to know for the people out there, our audience, and the developers watching this. To kind of end things off, I want to give you a chance to tell people how they can get more involved in Tezos, and also tell us what is your outlook or anything interesting that's launching on Tezos, in the next couple months or this year.
Yeah, so I think the best way is you can go to Tezos.com, and the site is being revamped. But you can go to Tezos.com, and there's a developer portal. You can also join the and if you go on Tezos.com and you scroll way at the bottom, you will see the social media link. So you have Telegram channels, Reddit, and the Riot channels, which I really like as a source of discussion. They don't see as much traffic as Telegram, but I think it's higher quality of conversation. So Riot is pretty good. Stack Exchange, get familiar with the documentation. Tezos.gitlab.io has some pretty good documentation, or reach out in general. In terms of what's coming and that's exciting, I think the launch of One-Off, which is the platform I mentioned earlier, who's doing NFTs for major musical artists, is super exciting. On the technology side, I think with these new use cases and with the exploding demand for transaction, we really have to focus on scalability. And I think this is a path which is going to be taken by both making the chain faster, but also introducing techniques like rollups, for example, to accommodate more throughput.
Awesome. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us here again at ReImagine 2021. Really interesting to speak to you. Thank you for your thoughts. And I look forward to speaking to you again, hopefully in a couple months.
Thanks, Roshan. Likewise.
Thank you, everyone. I'm your host, Roshan, and I'll let you all tune back in to more of ReImagine 2021, version 9, Game of Chains. Thank you.